College football nerds here doing part two of our Ohio State Alabama previews for this game. If you haven't seen the first one, it's less numbers nerdy and more matchups, schematics, what we saw in the playoff games, how these two teams match up against one another. And we were super long winded. So if you like to hear us talk, then that is definitely a video for you. You can check it out after this one. Go ahead and watch this one all the way through. Don't throw off our numbers for the YouTube algorithm. We are going to get into the computer model. This is more of our traditional preview discussion, normal cadence that y'all are used to. As always, please, if you want to help us out, share this. Rivals, Ohio State, 11 Warriors, Bama Online, any of those. Works great for us, helps us out, Twitter, Facebook, all that. But more importantly, in the comments, we need to know your score prediction. We need to know what you think about this game. And keep it friendly because these are two blue bloods going at it, and there's a lot of niceness we can bring to the table, bring some joy into 2021. All right, Josh, we've got Ohio State fans here and Alabama fans here that have heard us talk a lot about their respective teams. We've been talking, broke outside of that southern sort of walls a few years ago and have really been Ohio State ever since. So we know these teams really well and can speak to both of them really well. So what I want to do is just set these fan bases up with the other teams' really good stuff. So I'm going to take Alabama, but since I've been talking for a while, why don't you give me a break and kind of set Bama fans up with what Ohio State does really, really well. Let's talk about that as we get into this, and then when we get through that, we'll get into the model.
Ohio State started the season as a passing team with a defense that was starting to figure things out. And that's not shocking given the COVID situation. What they've turned into is a team with a dominant offensive line, a very strong run game, and a quarterback that has the ability to hit any pass anywhere on the field. Trey Sermon right now is averaging 7.55 yards per attempt. That's an absolutely absurd number, beyond what Derrick Henry had. Now it's 115 attempts, limited games, et cetera, but 7.5 yards per carry should frighten a lot of people. I mean, Master Teague has been effective, and he's a 5-yard per carry back. Sermon has kind of brought an extra spark, like frankly we thought he would, because we thought he was a dude at Oklahoma. He transferred because Kennedy Brooks is also a dude, but that's a different story. In the passing game, Justin Fields, I think, has really elevated his game beyond where he was in the past couple of years. 2019, he was a 9.2 yard per attempt guy, 41 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 181 QB rating. This year, he's a 9.9 yard per attempt guy, 21 touchdowns to 6 interceptions, 187 QB rating. I think he's become more accurate. I think he's reading the field better. I felt like he was kind of a one-read guy last year, and you didn't necessarily see it because there weren't a lot of turnovers. But they kind of either took the play was there, or he would, duck his head and start running. He's not that player anymore. He understands the offense a lot better. He had some issues at Northwestern, admittedly, but outside that, in many games early on when Ohio State was still sort of gelling on the O-line, always a normal thing people experience the first 4 or 5 games of a season, they really used Fields' arm, and he was very comfortable throwing first, passing the ball down the field. So I think the thing that you have to bear in mind with Ohio State, I know I kind of said both sides, but they really are a team that is able to run and pass. They are not as much a zone read quarterback run team as they had been in, like the JT Barrett era. They are more running back first, throw downfield second offense. They've got really good receivers in Wilson and Olave. I would say Wilson is the prototypical elite talent. Olave is, the kind of guy like a lot that Alabama's had where it's hard to put your finger on exactly why he's as good as he is, but he's smooth. He runs good routes. He catches well. Calvin Ridley might be the best example I have. I don't know if he'll quite measure up the same way, but a guy that just somehow is a lot better than he probably has any right to be, given his athletic ability. And I'll say defensively for Ohio State, the thing that strikes me the most is that they are very athletic. The defense on the defensive line is starting to come together. They, like Cooper and those guys, really, I felt like in the Clemson game, sort of stepped up to another level. Haskell Garrett and the interior of the D line is probably one of the best space eaters you'll see. His stats don't necessarily jump off the page, but he really does dictate the way a lot of teams play them. And the back end, I think the linebackers are good. They're hard nosed, maybe not coverage guys, but they're very physical. And the secondary has a lot of athleticism that, while they have had their miscues, they are able to turn and run with guys. And guys like Wade, as much as they may have issues in coverage, they're physical big guys that can punish you.
And the primer on Alabama for Ohio State fans is Mac Jones at quarterback is very unassuming looking. Like, he's not a runner. He's not super mobile in terms of a scrambler. He is a deadly, deadly quarterback, and he is incredibly efficient. I think that it would do Ohio State fans good to go back and watch the Alabama-Notre Dame game just to see 9.9 yards per attempt, and they were intentionally not going vertical. Notre Dame was too high safety all night, almost all night, and everything was in front of them, and Alabama, or Mac Jones, was still 9.9 yards per attempt, which is a yard more than Trevor Lawrence in the blowout win over Notre Dame. Sam Howell, who's another really good future NFL quarterback they saw this year, 7.8 yards per attempt. This Alabama offense is deadly, and there are some weaknesses defensively, and I think that'll show up in the model. Alabama's going to give up points in this game. The question is, and this is what I said to you earlier, Josh, with Alabama, their offense is so good, and this is not the Clemson offense that we saw Saturday night. Their offense is legitimately scary. You can score 35 and still lose by 2 touchdowns. That's a legitimate possibility in this game. Devonta Smith, everybody's going to focus on. The wide receivers beyond him are deep, and this is whether or not, there's some rumor that Waddle might come back. If he does, I suspect it's going to be mostly in a decoy capacity, but if he comes back and he's healthy, it's super scary. Georgia was fully healthy when they played Alabama earlier in the year, and they were the deepest, most talented, full of 5-star everything with the Kirby Smart defensive coordinator, basically, and they put up 41, pretty comfortable 41. So the offense for Alabama is the scary thing that you got to know. Obviously, Najee Harris, he had 8.3 yards per attempt per carry against Notre Dame, but he's also a guy that can really catch the ball out of the backfield. And that's one of the things that people aren't considering when they're worried so much about this passing attack. Defensively, probably best secondary in the country. The weakness there is that front seven, being able to put enough pressure to leverage the secondary. But best secondary in the country, they do cover up some of that front seven weakness. But overall, I think that it's Alabama. Look, I mean, we are so used to Alabama being a defensive juggernaut and just doing enough offensively to win the game. It's the flip side of that. They've got just enough. They have a good defense. Ohio State fans, don't get it twisted. They've got a good defense, not a great defense. A lot like Ohio State in that regard. They're going to be able to match anybody offensively, and I think they have the best offensive coordinator maybe that I've ever seen. So given these two realities, let's see what the model says about what we just said about these two teams, and remind everybody who may not know about the roots of this model in this game.
I've been running this model for a long time, and way before we started this podcast, there was an era where I did a blog, and I think the thing that put this on a lot of people's radar, got me started doing maybe more visible things, and finally Daniel drugged me out to put my voice on a video, was the Ohio State-Alabama model that I ran in 2014 and sort of the preview I had on that. The model actually had Ohio State winning that game. It had it 34-31. Obviously, the score there was 42-35, so, same general ballpark. 30 score, about a 1-score margin for Ohio State. And the concept there is just looking at how you did in a given season, how dominant you were in the season, and trying to figure out how that's actually going to, translate when you scale to a different level of competition. This has been a tough year. We don't know how conferences compare. I think our model, and we warned about this, was going to really struggle in the first round of bowl games, and it was going to really struggle when you saw, Clemson, Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State, all with no touch points between their conferences. I think what panned out is that the ACC was far worse than anyone really anticipated. Those statistics that were racked up in the ACC were not equivalent to what was in the Big Ten and the SEC. Obviously, the other thing we talked about was records don't matter that much. Conferences play themselves and themselves only. You're going to go 500 on average. You've got a certain number of wins, certain number of losses. Can't be anything else. People underestimated the Big Ten. They underestimated what it meant to have a winning record in the Big Ten, and they scoffed because there were a lot of teams with losing records just because when Ohio State beats everybody else gets a loss. And our model doesn't necessarily see it that way. And it looks positively on Ohio State blowing those teams out. Even if everyone else wants to poo-poo the other teams, it doesn't think that way. And it knows if you're dominating competition, you're a great team. In 2014, Ohio State dominated their schedule after the Virginia Tech loss. And our model saw that domination and said, yeah, the Big Ten, it knew that year the Big Ten wasn't great, but Ohio State is so much better than the Big Ten that Alabama, who won a lot of close-ish games or grind-out games, that margin against better competition wasn't as good as Ohio State's domination of lesser competition. This game, you still got a lot of disconnectedness, but what the model is basically saying is that Alabama, regardless of whether you think the SEC or the Big Ten's better, it more or less, our model right now thinks they're about the same. Alabama's domination is better than Ohio State's domination has been to this point. It has Alabama 48-36 over Ohio State. It says that really for a couple reasons. First, defensively, Alabama's allowing 76% of their opponents' rushing averages, about 87% of their opponents' passing averages. Passing numbers are hard to get down. That Ohio State Alabama pass defenses in 2014, Alabama was allowing 87% of opponent passing averages. So about the same number that you're seeing today. Ohio State was allowing about 83%. Not all that far off. Now, I will say in this game, Ohio State is at 85% of opponent rushing averages and 106% of opponent passing averages. So neither one of these defenses is as good as that 2014 game. Not really even close. And that's not just that it's a different era, which everybody's going to point out. And we point that all the time, right? That teams score more, everybody's more explosive. Relative to expectations, to national averages, these defenses are not all that far off from what a lot of other teams are putting up. In fact, Ohio State's is merely good against the run, and they're very average statistically against the pass compared to most Big Ten defenses. Alabama's run defense in that 2014 game was 62% of opponent rushing averages. And obviously they got run over. And that's a lot of why our concern is in this game, that they got run over by that Ohio State team, and how's this one going to do, because sometimes these things are a lie. But really, at the end of the day, Alabama's offense, 11 yards per attempt going into this, over 5 yards per carry, against an Ohio State team that plays well enough to keep you about your average. Alabama's average is 8 yards per play. And 8 yards per play is, as our model sees it, about 48 points. So Ohio State is expected to be very effective. 8.6 yards per attempt, 4.5 yards per carry, over 6.3 yards per play, lots of first downs, lots of touchdowns. That's still 36 points. That's a lot of points for high-level competition. The problem the model sees is, unlike 2014, where Ohio State was a couple notches better than the rest of the Big Ten, it's very concerned that Ohio State defensively has looked a lot like a lot of other defenses have when you played a given team. And I'll give you one anecdote, and I'll flip it back to Daniel to sort of comment. Ohio State shut down Clemson's run game in that matchup. Now, Clemson had not run the ball well in several games. They were shut down the first time they played Notre Dame to 1 yard per carry. But Trevor Lawrence, for all his struggles, was 8.3 yards per attempt. And his season average is 8.5 yards per attempt. So even in that domination, Ohio State gave up right about the average amount that Clemson was getting through the air going into that game. The run defense stepped up in a big way, which that could be something to matter in the Alabama game. But the concern really is, statistically, even coming out of that last one, Ohio State generally has allowed teams to do about what they normally do, throwing the football.
And I think for both teams, there's a concern here that's a little different, but kind of the same. So we saw Ohio State against Indiana. Ohio State fans have said famously, I think they held Indiana a -1 rushing yard. But then you look, and Indiana was 105th in rushing. They were not a good running team then. Indiana was still able to put up a lot of points in that game, being entirely one-dimensional. So even if you can take away the run game, which I don't know that anybody can fully take away the run game from Alabama, because the offensive line, and that's something I didn't talk about in the open, the offensive line is that good. You're even if you're completely one-dimensional, that one dimension for Alabama passing the ball is far better than anything Indiana does. Far better than anything Rutgers put on late, which is funny. The Rutgers game was very similar in terms of statistics to Clemson, and maybe you can touch on that in a little bit. But that's a concern if you're an Ohio State fan. But on the flip side, what did we see with Ole Miss against Alabama? The ability for Ole Miss to use very powerful running backs to run the ball had Alabama's defense on skates, which then allowed Ole Miss to make a lot of plays in the passing game. And then also we've seen Alabama struggle with a one-dimensional team in Florida that could not run the ball and still put up a bunch of points. So I think we've seen enough from these defenses to know that, again, and we've said this for a while now, and like you said, and you pointed out, it's fair to note that you can have an elite defense and still give up a lot of points. 2016 Alabama did it at Clemson. A lot of those Alabama-Clemson games. You can give up a lot of points. The issue here is these aren't elite defenses. These are merely good defenses. And I know for all of what Ohio State fans saw against Clemson and are super excited about their defense, and they should be, this is a different animal that they're going to face. Just like Alabama fans were excited with their defense in that stretch of like 5 or 6 games before they played Florida. They're like leading the nation in points per game allowed. And we said, hold on, it's a little bit of fool's gold. Florida's a different animal. Ohio State is completely that too. So talk about a little bit, we're not going to do predictions yet, but talk a little bit about if this is an absolute track meet, like Alabama Ole Miss, or like kind of like Indiana Ohio State turned out to be. Is there a team that it favors, and if so, which one and why?
I think if you're in a track meet, it tends to favor the team with the. No, there's two sides to it. One is it helps to have a mobile quarterback, because a mobile quarterback can extend plays and get a first down conversion when things break down. And in a track meet, it's important not to punt. And that mobile quarterback and the ability to find a way to get the emergency first down is how Clemson kept a lot of those games going against a lot of elite Alabama defenses in the mid-2010s. The other side, I will say, is it helps to have a quarterback that can very efficiently deliver the ball without mistakes. Both those teams have those things. Clemson struggled against Ohio State in large part because they gave up so many negative plays. We talked about in our first video, if you want to go listen to it, how the success rates for Clemson were actually higher than Ohio State, 57% success versus 52%. The difference is when they had a negative play, it was bad. And Ohio State was moving forward or not moving. Incomplete pass or you get yards. And when they get yards, it was explosive plays. When you have a guy like Justin Fields, you can extend plays, make explosive plays, you stress a defense, and I think you can find a way to get first downs when you need them in a game where stuff starts to, end up in a track meet, feels like things are going off the rails, and you magic your way to a first down. And Alabama's side, I think Mac Jones has almost uncanny ability to find the open guy, throw against the blitz. One of the better quarterbacks I've seen in recent years in terms of stepping up in the pocket and throwing while being hit. And I think it was one of the funny things to me is he kind of exemplifies maybe the drawbacks to the 3-and-out world that we're at with college football players, guys that are starting as a freshman or sophomore and they're out very quickly. Jones shows a level of maturity with how he plays the position that you don't see a ton anymore. I don't know that Jones is going to be the quarterback Fields is in the NFL. I mean, I don't honestly don't think he will be, frankly, because of the intangibles, and that's not a shock on Jones. It's more that Fields' ceiling is really, really high. Jones is a much further level of development than Justin Fields is right now. If Justin Fields had Mac Jones' sort of command of the pocket and his understanding of how to throw against a blitz, his understanding of how to identify a blitz and throw against it, dump the ball off consistently, Fields would be an unstoppable juggernaut. And to me, I think that's why in a shootout of those two things, I'm going to lean a little bit more towards Alabama. And that's with the final caveat that even if he's healthy, I think the injury to Justin Fields means they're going to be a little hesitant to use his legs, and he's not going to be as gritty a runner. He may be elusive, he may be able to scramble and run, but he's not going to run through a tackle, I don't think. I just don't think he's going to be healthy enough to do that. And taking away that edge probably gives a little bit of an edge to Alabama.
Okay, it's pick time. Pick time for me, pick time for you. This is a game that after Saturday night, initially, I was like, how does Alabama beat a team that beat Clemson so bad, and Clemson was good enough to beat that Notre Dame team just as bad as Alabama did? Like, that was my thought. And it's a weird, long train of thought to say, look, Clemson's good enough, whether or not they're elite, they're good enough to beat the ever-loving crap out of Notre Dame. Ohio State's good enough to beat the team that could do that. So how do you beat them? How, like, Cooper flashed all night on tape. I mean, the Clemson offensive line was overwhelmed. Clemson defensive line never even got close to Fields. Dude was making a sandwich back there on the deep balls. So they never forced Ohio State into an uncomfortable position because they couldn't. So can Alabama's defense do that? Can their offensive line do that? And then I went back and watched the Alabama-Notre Dame game, looked at some of the advanced metrics that we talked about, and saw that, Alabama dominated that game in a way that really didn't show up on the scoreboard. And Ohio State, I think Ohio State fans aren't going to love me saying this, but I do think that some of their being that good, I still think they're better than Clemson, but being that good was artificially good because they were able, in my mind, in my heart of hearts, I think they prepped for Clemson starting a month ago. Because I think they're way better than Northwestern, and that game was just weird, and I think it was because they were already prepping for Clemson. They're not going to be able to do that with Alabama. But they're still good enough offensively to make Alabama fans uncomfortable all night, and this defense uncomfortable. Give me 44-38 Alabama. This is going to be an incredibly stressful game all night for both teams because it's going to be a back and forth. One play could be the difference. Could be the onside kick in 2015 for Alabama. Could be Zeke busting it for 80 yards against Alabama. One play could be the difference, which means 44-38 for Alabama. I don't have a ton of confidence there. It's a one-score game in my mind. So I'm not going to be eating a ton of crow if Ohio State wins because I'm not going to be shocked if Ohio State wins. All right, Josh, give me yours.
When I look at the game and my score prediction, and I was wrong, right? I mean, I thought Clemson might win by a couple scores. I had Clemson with the spread. I try to figure out why the game went as sideways as it did. And when I make that analysis, I go to the natural point for figuring out why Clemson would lose in any game, and that's Rutgers. And now hopefully someone's chuckled somewhere. The issue I have with Ohio State in trying to pick this game is that they had 8.88 yards per play against Clemson. The next best game all season was Rutgers at 7.95 yards per play. And the thing that I've been racking my brain about is how did Ohio State not just beat their averages, but they were a yard per play better than any other game all season against Clemson. Justin Fields in that Rutgers game, 11.2 yards per attempt. Trey Sermon, 5.7 yards per carry. Against Clemson, 13.8 yards per attempt, 6.2 yards per carry, even higher averages. In fact, Rutgers ran the ball better than Clemson did. A little bit worse passing, but both teams are about at their averages. So, personal take, I think it was about matchups. I think the issue that all of us missed was that Clemson hadn't played a team that could really stretch the ball vertically and that had the offensive line to block them long enough to do it. We talked about this in the matchups. I think probably some people forecasted this is where I might go a little bit. But I think this is a very different matchup for Ohio State. I do think Alabama is a little bit better of a team. I know a lot of Ohio State fans may balk at that today, but I want you to take 2 steps back and think about where you felt like about your team coming out of the Northwestern game. Nothing about Alabama's performance against Notre Dame was troubling. They dominated that game totally. Now, they had a scary game against Florida that makes me think their defense is going to give up points. But quite frankly, no one, including Ohio State, has the multiplicity, if you want to use that word, that Florida has. When they had Pitts, when they had Toney, when they had Grimes, when they had Copeland, they had an ability to get Alabama isolated coverage on a guy like Pitts or Toney and make them put more DBs than Alabama was really comfortable doing. Ohio State has really good players in Olave and Wilson, and I know there's tremendous depth in that receiving core, but they're not going to roll out. I don't care that you have the number 1 freshman in the country from last year. He hasn't played a lot. You're not going to roll him out and stress him in that manner. Alabama has maybe the best secondary in the country. Clemson looked like, I think they were really subpar in a way that nobody had seen because nobody, again, been able to stress them. I think Ohio State's going to struggle to throw the ball vertically just a little bit more. And at the end of the day, Alabama's receiving core and passing game is a completely different animal than Clemson. And I've seen Ohio State struggle with that kind of a passing game this year. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. I have Alabama 51, Ohio State 41. And to me, it really does come down to the fact that in a track meet, I think Alabama's secondary is going to get enough wins to force a couple negative plays or to, just forced breakups, turnovers. And really, again, you talk about like Surtain at Alabama. Outside the one play where he pretty clearly lost the ball against Florida and just let it go by him, play after play and game after game, I've seen that guy take what is a dead-on deep shot to a great receiver, go stride for stride, and just swat the ball away at the last second. Those plays, I think, are going to be enough to give Alabama the edge. I think Ohio State's going to move it a lot and comfortably. I think Ohio State's run game could be very effective and is going to drive that lack of comfort from Alabama. But at the end of the day, I think what we see is the full-fat Alabama offense being pushed to the highest gear that it has to attain. And I just don't think with 166% of opponent averages, perfectly average pass defense from Ohio State, against an offensive line that's going to be able to block well enough to give Jones time, I just don't think Ohio State has the horses to keep Alabama from scoring 50.
Yeah, and I think what people need to realize, both fan bases, and this is why, as a fan, you don't love these games. They're so incredibly stressful. I want to prepare Ohio State fans and Alabama fans because this is coming. It's going to be an uncomfortable game. This is the best receiving core that either team has faced all year. This is the best offensive line by far that either team has faced all year. And this is the best quarterback that either team has faced all year. And that's a team that's faced Trevor Lawrence and faced Kyle Trask. And when I say quarterback, I mean in their systems. And the system is part of it. So, no, Mac Jones is not going to go ahead of Trevor Lawrence, but he's going to be more effective than Trevor Lawrence was in his system in terms of matchups, like you were saying. I want to wind this down. I want to give you an opportunity to say something too, but I want to give some shout outs real quick because this has been a tough year for us. Stop, start. Didn't know if we're going to have one, and we just have a lot of gratitude that we were able to do this, especially with Ohio State fans. Just a few shout outs. Y'all know who you are. Kevin Noon at Rivals, my buddy. And brother-in-law Richard, Vigo, our friends at Land Grant Holy Land, who Josh is going to do a podcast with later this week. We got to keep it together. Our YouTube kind of College Football Mafia, Josh Pate, RJ Young, Brian Glaze, and the guys over at Fanatic Perspective. Great Texas chatter going on over there as well. Twitter game is a lot of fun. There's a lot of y'all on Twitter that we really love and appreciate. So I want to also give some gratitude there. Josh, anything you want to say about this game, about this season? This isn't the last y'all going to hear from us, but this is an opportunity that maybe has a lot of ears and eyeballs to say a few words.
It's been an interesting season. I still feel like we don't really know enough about conferences and different teams. A lot of the discussion is going to focus on the SEC versus the Big Ten. The Big Ten had a dominant bowl season. The SEC was up and down. I'll say every SEC team that had starters played well. The two teams that got blown out were missing at least a third of their starting lineups. I feel like you can't take enough out of those games. Florida, you said best receiving core. I mean, Florida was an awesome receiving core, awesome quarterback. I don't know that I would say that they were worse than Ohio State, but if I were Ohio State and I feel like I can replicate what Florida did, I'd feel pretty comfortable because I know my defense is a lot better than Florida's. At the end of the day, though, that's the point. This isn't about conferences. It's about teams. The defining characteristic to me about Alabama and Ohio State, 2014 Ohio State was discounted because the Big Ten wasn't very good. But Ohio State was awesome. More than any other team in the country, maybe Clemson falls in this category. These two teams frequently do not represent whatever the ups and downs of the other teams in their conferences are. They rise above it as a unique thing. And I think we're going to get a unique matchup. I think we're going to see things that we're not expecting. I still don't really know how this is going to turn out or feel comfortable with it. And I will say this last bit, and I'm curious if you agree with me. I do think, and we talked about in the Clemson game, the lack of number of games played could be a concern. It feels, and I said in that video, and I discounted it, or maybe just look past my own statement, that about 6 games in a season is when teams usually turn the corner and resolve. And that's right where Ohio State was. I am still a little concerned, though, that Ohio State is going into this game with a lot less experience. Alabama was tested against Florida, was tested against Georgia, and I do think if there's a blowout in this game, I'm going to be surprised if Alabama gets blown out. I feel like they've earned their stripes enough that they're going to find a way to stay in it. And if I have one concern about this game turning out poorly, it's that I think there still is an outside chance an Ohio State team that is, I mean, they've played 5 less games than Alabama, could come into this one, see some things they're not expecting. And just like I think what happened with Clemson against Ohio State, where their secondary was exposed, because in a way that maybe they could have covered up if they knew it was coming, that maybe Ohio State sort of gets exposed in the same way that wouldn't have happened if the Big Ten had actually managed to give them a full schedule.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good thing to end on. Everybody, including Dabo, said that this is a negative for everybody who has to play Ohio State, that they're fresh and rested and only got to play 6 games. We've said it, we've maintained consistency there, that it is more a negative than it is a positive because you don't know how you're going to call a certain game in a certain way or a certain play to play because you haven't faced that live fire to know how your team's going to react, how your players are going to react, and what kind of plays to call. And that's what we said was going to be the problem. I know this is kind of weird to bring it back to Michigan, but Gaddis going to Michigan was a horrible hire because he'd never called plays before, so he didn't have that memory bank of things to know when things got tough, what to call in certain scenarios. And I think it's cost them. And I think it's why Michigan's not very good offensively, among other things, like their head coach. All right, y'all. This was a lot of fun. Again, just really excited that we were able to do this year. And it came down to these 2 teams in the national championship game. Super exciting. We're going to be mixing it with y'all all week in the comments on both of these videos. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great national championship game, and we'll see y'all after. God bless.